make your strongest case, your go-to scriptures. Make that case for baptismal regeneration. That baptism is actually part of what regenerates you. I know you just mentioned Titus 3:5, and there are other scriptures for sure. Maybe just kind of walk us through, why do you believe this?
Sure. I think if you're talking specifically about the term regeneration, we generally think of there are three sets of texts that are cited more than anything else um, in terms of just defining what regeneration is. So those would be Titus 3:5, then we would have John chapter 3, and then we'd have the prophecy of the new heart in Ezekiel 36.
Mhm.
Now, I don't think it is, coincidental that of all three of those primary texts to speak about regeneration, every single one of them mentions water.
Mhm.
So we have the sprinkling of clean water aligned with the giving of the new heart in Ezekiel chapter 36. We have being born of water and the Spirit in John chapter 3. And I think that there is sufficient textual reason to assert that that is most likely referring to baptism. And I know there are alternate interpretations, but I don't think they fit the text. And then the other is Titus 3, the washing of regeneration. So the three primary texts that all speak about regeneration all use water. They all have water imagery. And in none of those texts are we given some kind of indication that water doesn't really mean water or washing doesn't really mean washing. And ultimately, when we look at the various passages that talk about baptism, never do we have a text that speaks about baptism as something symbolic. We have texts, like 1 Peter 3, that baptism now saves you. I see, I saw in the comments, I checked the chat before this, and people are like, baptism doesn't save you, Jesus saves you. Well, you have to say baptism saves you in some sense because that's what Scripture says. So in what sense does baptism save is really the question you have to ask, not does baptism save? And you can answer that question by saying, well, it's not a water baptism, it's a spiritual baptism. That doesn't really fit the text either because there's a parallel there between the flood and the waters of the flood through which Noah and his family were saved, 8 in all is what the text says. And Peter, in talking about the connection between baptism and the flood, say corresponding to this, to the waters of the flood, baptism now saves you. Now, if we're going to draw that image out consistently, what happened in the flood? Were Noah and his family symbolically saved? Was the water a symbol of something? Of course not. The water was that which, first of all, killed the wicked in the world, which is the majority of people at the time. And the water is literally that which saved Noah and his family. They were literally saved from the actual wrath of God in this visible manifestation of that in the flood. So corresponding to that, as Peter says, baptism now saves you. In that there is a washing that, like in the flood, actually saves. And I think we can also talk about a washing away of wickedness in baptism as the fulfillment of the flood in terms of the washing away of sin. So just as sin is eradicated at the flood, in a sense, through the washing away of the wicked, our wickedness is drowned in the flood or in the floods of the baptismal waters. And there's a second parallel that we have between an Old Testament event and there are many others as well, I think, types of baptism in the Old Testament. But there's another one that Paul specifically points out in 1 Corinthians, where Paul connects the crossing of the Red Sea event to baptism. And he refers to this crossing of the Red Sea as the Israelites being baptized into Moses.
Mhm.
They were baptized into Moses. Now, ask the question, what kind of baptism was that? Was that a symbolic baptism? Were the waters in the Red Sea? Because again, water is used. Clearly, there's a connection with water. That's kind of the whole point of the parallel. So to say it's spirit baptism simply doesn't fit the parallel. What kind of salvation was that? Was that baptism into Moses? What happened with water there? Was that something that was symbolic? Or was it the actual literal saving of the Israelites from actual destruction from physical captors?
Mhm.
That's what we have in the story, right? So every time we have so this is, I know this is a big a big answer here to a
No,
question
that's good. That's
not
good.
that big, but if I could summarize kind of the argument maybe in 3 points, right? So let me kind of summarize. So first, every time we have the primary text to talk about regeneration, all of them mention water. Second, we have very specific parallels in the Old Testament we call types of baptism. And in each of those types, there is an actual salvation. They are not symbolic. The third point is simply that every time we read about baptism in the New Testament, say in the letters of Paul, it is connected to something that actually happens to us. You are baptized into Christ, into his death. So look at Romans chapter 6, verse 1, for example. And that kind of language of being baptized into Christ, which, in Galatians, Paul says you put on Christ. That's another way of speaking about baptism there. He's explicit. He says this is baptism. That every time that baptism is pointed to in the New Testament, in one of the epistles, it is connected to an actual saving event. There is not one instance of a New Testament author kind of backing off of that and saying, but wait, it just symbolizes this, or wait, it's not really connected to this. Mm-hmm. And in light of all of that witness that we have from both the Old and the New Testament, it really is simply the straightforward reading of the text to say that baptism saves you. And I would make the argument that is the only way you can come away with something else is by importing something into the text, not drawing it out of the text.
Okay, so let me